Recorded live from a pub in a peaceful and calm Birmingham, welcome to Bible After Hours. My name is Luke Ollie, and I think the Bible is well worth a read, whether you're a Christian or not. But I'm no expert on it, and there's lots I could learn. Luckily, I know a few people who are far more knowledgeable than me, so I thought I'd record a podcast series in a local pub to give me an excuse to hang out with these guys and ask them lots of questions over a drink. In this session, we are going to look at war and peace and the Bible's take on it all. We have a live audience in as usual. Despite the noise, they do appear to be a peaceful bunch tonight, which is good. We're hoping there will be no wars on our panel tonight, as we have two great guests who are going to take us through a potted history of the Bible's influence on war over the last 2,000 years, and what the book says about the idea of peace. So it's no small task ahead of us. We'll do our best. When we first came up with the idea of this topic, I had hoped we could maybe be celebrating a decline in conflicts. Maybe we could toast a new treaty or two, but unfortunately, sadly not tonight. And maybe when the podcast has gone out, maybe. You never know. But hopefully, after listening to this podcast, we can all become mini peacekeepers in the world around us. And if that sounds too much of a task, at least within the warring factions of our own minds, or am I being too ambitious, possibly? Before we get stuck in, I'd like to encourage you all to subscribe to our podcast and give us a positive rating on whatever platform you listen to us on. You can also check us out on Instagram, on WhatsApp, and we now have a Facebook page. So it's all very exciting and slowly turning into some media guru here. It's a very slow transformation. If you're listening in Birmingham, then why don't you come along to the next recording? All are welcome. Dates and topics can be found at bvc.so/Bible After Hours. You'll get the chance to meet the panel and ask more questions when the recording stops. So yes, panelists, beware. Now, as usual, we have our dictionary corner for fact-checking, extra questions, and essentially, more support for me. This time, we have Jeff back with us. Jeff was on our podcast previously in the Bible and Purpose session, which was great, and so well worth a listen if you haven't already. Welcome back, Jeff.
Thanks, Luke. Great to be here. Good to be back.
We've actually moved Dictionary Corner, so you're not so much in the corner, but we're not going to change the name because I think it works. You're now actually sat next to me, which I think is better. We'll see how we go. It's certainly a lot easier to see you.
I'll try not to sabotage your iPad.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. Fingers off. As always, there's 3 house rules we ask everyone to keep when listening to our podcast. So, Jeff, I think, why don't you run them through for everybody?
Excellent. Okay. So the first is know yourself. Appreciate that we all come with preconceptions, backgrounds, and hang-ups. So be aware of that. And if possible, try and come with an open mind. Secondly, none of us know at all. So hopefully we can all learn together. And finally, don't shoot the messenger. Let's be kind and have fun.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So is everybody happy with the rules of the game?
Yeah.
Great. So let's play then. So we're going to get our first panelist up. Andy, you are already here, sat next to me. So welcome to the panel. And welcome to Bible After Hours, Andy.
Thank you for having me.
Andy, you're one of my regular drinking friends, which saying that out loud sounds like I have a far busier social life than I possibly do. But whenever we hang out, it always sort of seems the topic of conversation leans towards politics and history.
Yeah, I lower the tone depending on your perspective on those things.
Yeah, you're very much into that kind of stuff, right? So what do you do with yourself usually? Are you into politics and history in general?
Yeah, so I'm a history and politics teacher by profession. I have a little bit of background in terms of researching the ancient world and classics and things like that. So I enjoy reading about it and I enjoy talking about it as well. But my day-to-day job is teaching history and politics, which is never boring and always changing. So it does spill into my social life as well.
Yeah, it's it's an interesting topic, and whenever I sort of referenced it, you got very excited, so I thought you'd be the perfect guy.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I'm not the best at small talk. I kind of go straight in with religion and politics, which so I don't get invited out very often. So it's nice to be here, Luke. Thanks for giving me an evening out.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
It's great to have you on board. And in fact, we've kicked off with a question to the audience that I think. Jeff, it would be good to get what we asked the audience and their opinions on it. So what was the question we asked them?
So our question was, do you think the Bible has led to more or less peace in the world, or not made any difference?
It's a big one, isn't it? I mean, that's essentially what we've got to try and summarise tonight, I think, partly. Andy, have you got an opinion, yes, no, or maybe not at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. You could take the balance sheet approach, couldn't you, of trying to tot up whether it's in war or in peace. But I like to think it leads more to peace. We'll talk a bit more later, won't we, about the way that the Bible has been used and misused. But I'd be going for peace.
More peace.
More peace.
Okay,
yeah.
well, let's see if the audience agreed with you or not. Jeff, what were the scores on the doors?
Yeah, so there were 3 options. Coming in at third at 10% was that the Bible has contributed less peace in the world. And second, at 20% was no difference. But storming ahead at 70% is that most people in the audience are saying the Bible has contributed to more peace in the world.
And we're in a positive place tonight. Good.
Yeah, it wasn't 100%, in which case I thought we could just go home.
Yeah, you were concluded already. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. All right. So that's a good place to kick off then. So Andy, we're going to turn to you and we're going to start diving into this topic. So firstly, I think what's important is to try and set some of the context of how the Bible was, when the Bible was written. Because it was written, 2,000-3,000 years ago. I'm guessing societal views have changed and developed since then. So what was the people who were around at that point, what were they thinking about war and peace at that point in time in history?
Yeah, so in an earlier podcast, Pete talked a bit about the Bible not being a single book, but being a collection of 66 different books. And they're written across a broad period of time, sort of about 1,200 BC up to roughly 100 AD. And helpful probably to start with the Old Testament, start at the beginning. And the Old Testament narrative, a lot of it is about the people of God, the Hebrews, the Israelites, and their interactions with empires and with other powers around them. And initially in the start of Genesis, it's the Egyptians, sort of 1,500 BC onwards. You later get a few other groups like the Hittites, and then in quick succession there's Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Macedonians, Alexander the Great warrior king.
All the big hitters.
Yeah, absolutely.
Romans, I guess, is in there somewhere.
Yeah, Romans are coming. I won't forget about my beloved Romans. Don't you worry. And actually, in terms of those empires, they're all quite different, but there are some commonalities when there comes to our topic of war. Generally, they're all well up for a war.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah.
Absolutely. If you've got an empire to establish, that actually you are looking to fight wars. And the perception of war is that it's something that's righteous, that it's necessary. It's an opportunity to expand their power, opportunity to conquer, to vanquish. Yep. And then we get to the New Testament, the main empire that is interacting with the biblical writers and the topics of those Bible passages is the Roman Empire, about sort of 27 BC onwards. Mm-hmm. And the Romans famously have established a huge empire from Hadrian's Wall in Scotland down to sub-Saharan Africa, far out east to modern-day Iran and Iraq. And they've done that through violent bloodshed. They've done that through conquest. Okay, we've probably most of us seen the film Gladiator. You get a bit of a taste of that. Okay,
yeah, good film.
Good film. Gladiator 2,
not good.
Not good. Yeah, I've not watched that yet. Actually, can't bring myself to it. Anyway, and the Romans famously have a peace. They call it Pax Romana, and my limited Latin knowledge will tell you that's the peace of the Romans. And it sounds nice, but actually, even the Romans themselves were quite aware that this was a slightly odd type of peace. There's a Roman historian called Tacitus who writes in the 2nd century AD about his own people, and he puts into the mouth of a Gallic chieftain who's just been defeated by the Romans, he puts into his mouth a famous saying that you Romans, you make a desert and you call it peace. And he actually writes, to robbery, slaughter, plunder, they give the lying name of empire. They make a solitude, they make the absence of anything, make it dead, and they call it peace.
Yeah, that's probably not what we have in modern times that are sort of aims for peace. Right?
No,
I
I
mean,
don't
I'm
think
sure
so.
it's a peace of sorts.
Yeah. I don't think so.
But,
And obviously attitudes to empire have been changing in recent years and have been quite a hot topic issue. But I think there's a kind of generality of those empires in the biblical period and who are talked about in the Bible of seeing empire as glorious, as necessary, and war as a way to conquer. And actually, these kings and these soldiers, it's a way of proving their virility.
Yeah.
And their virtue. Actually, they see war as being virtuous, that peace will only be attained through domination, and that within that, particularly within the Romans and these other empires, it's very hierarchical, it's very oppressive, slave states essentially.
Yeah.
So it's a quite a harsh view of war, and even the peace that they attain is quite harsh as well.
Okay, so that's when the writers of the Bible across those thousands of years were writing.
Mm-hmm.
Often they're in that context of, I guess, either being dominated or trying to dominate the civilizations around them. So I guess the next question then really is, how does that now compare with the views that were presented in the Bible? Obviously there's lots of views in the Bible. We can't summarize in maybe one statement, but the sort of general ethos that's being trying to be portrayed within the Bible, does it align with those, or is it different? Is it challenging them in any way?
Yeah, so the biblical writers are obviously writing across a broad period of time, but I think in each period that they are writing, they present a very different view of war and of peace to that of which is around them. And the ultimate kind of ethic of the Bible, arguably, is peace. That is ultimately what we're aiming for. I think Jeff has got a verse that kind of illustrates a difference for us.
Excellent. Right, yeah, so first Bible verse of the evening with Jeff here. What have you got, Jeff?
Yeah, so we'll be having a look in a moment at Isaiah 9, verse 6.
Who's Isaiah then? What's going on with Isaiah?
Just thought I could put it in some context. So Isaiah is a book in the Old Testament, and it was written around 700 years before the birth of Jesus. Isaiah is a prophetic book, so that is a book that is essentially filled with someone who claims to have received divine messages, and those have been written down. So Isaiah was a prophet who was working in about the 8th century, advising kings and delivering divine messages, and particularly well known for kind of bringing a divine message of the hope of a coming savior, which the Jewish people called the Messiah. And this is one of those.
I'm sure the Messiah theme is going to come up in many of our future podcasts as well. Yeah. So
Indeed.
What is he saying that's particularly pertinent about tonight?
Yeah. So, I mean, you might be familiar with these from Handel's Messiah or from any carol service that you've been to.
Okay.
But it's Isaiah 9, verse 6, and it
Can
says...
you sing it?
No. No. You're the singer around here, Luke.
Have I?
Isaiah 9, verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace.
Right. Andy, how does this then summarize what we've been talking about and where we're going then? How does the Bible look at this?
So I think this passage indicates quite a helpful contrast between the empire view and the biblical view of war and peace. So I talked a bit about the Romans earlier. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, would often put out pronouncements and royal kind of announcements and spread his titles of Saviour, of Lord, of Son of God, of bringer of peace. The Roman emperor would use those. But when he's using those, he's using them as a way of dominating.
Had you read them in Isaiah?
No, indeed, yeah. It almost seems like that, doesn't it? But he was using it in a very oppressive and controlling way. Whereas the true Prince of Peace, Jesus, that we see in the gospel narratives, is born into the world, and he comes not as a military leader. He doesn't come as a conquering general. And actually some of the Jewish people at the time, when they were looking to the Messiah, something we'll talk about later, their kind of savior, someone to come help them, they were, some of them, expecting or hoping for a military general who would come in might and kick out the Romans. Actually, Jesus subverts that expectation, and he comes into the world in very humble means. Even that you mentioned kind of Advent and Christmas, even the narrative of Jesus' birth in Luke is sometimes seen as kind of a parody of these royal imperial announcements. The writers and Jesus are turning that view of war, empire, and peace upside down. And Jesus later on actually enters Jerusalem, and you'd expect a conquering king to enter on a giant war horse. He enters in on a donkey.
We're actually doing Easter in a few months' time,
Excellent.
so we'll go through that in more detail.
Won't spoil that one too much for you. It's something to look forward to, and it fits with like the big story of the Bible, really. So it just quickly, we have a way of understanding the Bible where we start with creation, we have a fall, we have redemption, and we have the new creation. And so creation, we start with peace. At the start of the world, the Bible is clear that it's a time of peace, it's a time of wholeness, it's a time of fulfillment. And then something goes wrong. We get fall. We get sin entering the world, and that's where violence comes in. That's when war comes in. It's not part of God's best for us. It's not part of God's design for the world. Now, thankfully, God doesn't kind of leave us to it and leave us to our violent ways of killing. He enters into the world through Jesus, who is providing the redemption part of this story. He comes to bring reconciliation. That actually he will make a way for us to know God. But we still have to wrestle with violence. We live in like this middle period where Jesus has come, but there's also violence. And then finally, the new creation. Christians and the Bible looks forward to this idea that Jesus will return and will make all things new, that peace will be restored. So actually, the big story of the Bible is quite contrasting to the empire one that I've outlined earlier. The Bible says, arguably, that true peace comes through reconciliation, not violence, whereas empire would say violence. And the Old Testament uses this word shalom to describe peace. It pops up quite a few times throughout the Old Testament. And that concept of peace is more than just like a lack of violence, okay? It's not like the aftermath of a fight, okay, where people are not actively punching each other at that time. It's actually more than that. It's a fullness, it's a wholeness, it's a flourishing of life, very different to that oppressive empire view. And so the empire is violent and hierarchical, dominated by an emperor. Biblical peace is kind of rooted in love, rooted in justice, challenging injustice, and it's led by Jesus, who's a servant king. He's the Prince of Peace. He's not a dominant emperor.
Right, so we're not looking for that desert of peace.
No, absolutely not.
We're looking for fullness and a life in that shalom process.
Absolutely.
Now, if the Bible is trying to sort of indicate that the peace is the right space to be in, and that's what we want to see, and that's where we want to go, I guess you'd look at the Bible and you'd expect to see efforts towards peace being, one of the main things contained within it. But actually, reading through, you'd be sort of you wouldn't necessarily see that as the main theme a lot of the time. Certainly, in the Old Testament, there are a number of stories where war seems to be the main theme, the main aim of the game here. So, we see the societies sort of being destroyed, and potentially you could even say maybe there's references to genocide and that kind of stuff. So we're really in the happy space tonight here. How does that sit alongside that concept of peace? And we want to encourage peace and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, let's destroy all these people. Yay! Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's a difficult question. It's a tricky question. I think that question that people often raise as a criticism of the Bible. It comes from a range of Old Testament narratives where the Israelites are seemingly told to fight certain groups of people, particularly as part of their conquest of a land called Canaan, so when they're establishing themselves as somewhere to live after they've been wandering through the desert. There's lots of passages we could use, but I think Jeff is going to give us one kind of example of those narratives.
Yeah, so I've got Deuteronomy 20 verses 16 to 17, and this is God giving some giving instructions to Moses, who is leading the people of Israel at the time after they'd escaped from slavery in Egypt. And he says, "However, in the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you."
Right. So, as far as peace, that's the sort of desert peace, isn't it, that we're talking about here? The complete destruction. So how do we sort of stand that up against the peaceful God of Jesus and that kind of stuff? Where does that land?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult, and that's not the only other example. We could pull out the conquest of the city of Jericho. 1 Samuel 15, a bit later on in the Bible stories, there is the king of Israel, Saul, and he's seemingly commanded by God to destroy this group called the Amalekites. And I think your response to this will probably also partly depend on your view of the Bible as a whole. Like, what do you see the Bible as, and how do you view it? I would suggest maybe 2 principles for dealing with this and dealing with other passages. I'm going to go with wrestling and look for the context. So I think we are meant to find passages like this shocking. We're meant to find passages like this troubling because we are being invited in to kind of wrestle with them and to work out what exactly that is meant by them. There's a long tradition within Christianity and indeed Judaism. There's this term called midrash, which means a few different things, but part of that is kind of entering to the text and wrestling it and chewing it over. That we can't give like easy, glib answers. I'm not going to necessarily be able to give in the next 5 minutes a comprehensive answer to that.
I imagine there's full books. And,
there is full
PhDs
books. Yeah, I've got some in my bag actually. We're going to do some book recommendations.
We will stick. Actually, we will put them in the notes for the podcast.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of book recommendations. Well, one particularly good one is called "Is God a Moral Monster?" by Paul Copan, which is quite an eye-catching title, and his answer is no.
I was going to say, conclusion is
absolutely, which is helpful for us.
Okay.
So wrestle with it because it is tricky. And the second one I talked about was context. So I think context is really key here. It's quite difficult sometimes taking isolated examples out and trying to extrapolate from them. So if you can bear with me a slightly silly analogy. Star Wars. You a Star Wars fan, Luke?
Well, I'm called Luke. Certainly my dad was.
Excellent. Okay. So, favorite trilogies, the old ones.
The old ones.
Yeah, obviously. The middling ones are okay. They're sort of the early noughties. The new ones will pretend don't exist. Okay. So let's imagine you've never seen Star Wars. Okay, and imagine I'm like, okay, we've got 5 minutes. I'm going to show you the best bit. I'm going to show you the scene where Luke Skywalker blows up the Death Star. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, devoid of all context, you might sit there and watch that, and you might be thinking, This young guy's really determined to blow up this space station with thousands of people on. He really wants to kill all of them.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure.
He's not a hero.
Yeah, he's not a hero. Okay, and then there's this guy in this big black mask and this hood, and he's flying in trying to stop Luke blowing up all these innocent people.
Poor Darth Vader.
Yeah, absolutely, and he's got respiratory problems as well. Absolutely.
Disabled Darth Vader.
Yeah, absolutely. Got to be careful there.
Yeah.
So. Actually, the context is really important because actually, if you just look at that, you wouldn't understand the bigger picture and that bigger story. So generally with Bible passages like that, we need to wrestle them, but we need to look with the context. So I'd suggest...
Are we saying that one of these tribes has a Darth Vader type character in there?
Yeah, well, indeed, yeah. We could look to that as well. So I think first let's maybe deal with what the text is saying and the context. So the language that often gets translated around like completely destroying and devoting them to destruction, it comes often from like this term in Hebrew of herem warfare. And actually what that is really trying to signify when they're using language like that in the text isn't necessarily that literally everyone is going to die. What they're trying to signify is that there's like a complete shift in the power balance. It's like a total overturning of who's in control of that region. The closest analogy we've got is football, really. Okay, and if you've got people going to a West Brom Aston Villa game, okay, and they'll be shouting across at each other, "We're going to slaughter you. We're going to kill you." Okay, and hopefully that's not literal. Okay, hopefully that's not actually going to happen, but they might use that kind of hyperbolic language. So there's definitely an element of that going on. And actually, when we look at those people groups that are mentioned in some of those passages, we know from the archaeological record and we know from the biblical record that they were not completely wiped out. I mean, I mentioned earlier the Amalekites, where they're seemingly all killed in one passage. Right. Later on in that same book of Samuel, they reappear. So they're clearly not there. So the writers are really trying to emphasize this kind of overturning of the power balance.
Is it not just that they just didn't do a good job?
Well, I mean, again, it could also come down to your view of the Bible in that as well, that actually some people would argue that actually you can look at these passages as being the moral of that story is how bad sin is. And actually it's these people at the time, just their understanding of what's going on in the world and their reflections of what they think God said, but actually it turns out later it's not. I mean, it depends how you see the Bible and how you see the text. But if we're taking it kind of at its word, I'd suggest that's one helpful thing for us to think about. I think also maybe a helpful bit of context is most of the sites and events and battles that are being talked about here, civilians wouldn't really be there. So the famous story of Jericho, where the walls come down, is a song which I won't get Jeff to sing. But that would be essentially like a military fort. It'd be a castle. There wouldn't be women and children in those places. It would just be fighting men. Because actually the first thing you do when there's a siege coming along is you send out all the women and children from those places because there's many, many mouths to feed. So actually, I think the context there would suggest that these aren't like straightforward genocides. I think we'd also need to think probably about like the God part of it, like the apparent commands of God ordering people to die. And that's tricky. That's something we have to wrestle with. I suggest one way of looking at it, and this is a way that Christians have looked at it for thousands of years, going back to Augustine in the sort of 4th, 5th century, and then Thomas Aquinas a bit later. They would point out that God ultimately is the one who gives life, but ultimately he's the one who takes it away as well. And in this case, he's choosing to take life away earlier. Because we're all ultimately going to die, and that is the way that God ends up taking away life. And this rare exception, and this kind of one-time command in this series of conquests of Canaan, he's choosing to act earlier to take that life away. Because actually the context of these groups is that they're living like what we'd call it like deeply immoral. They've got horrible practices. You've got all sorts of things like child sacrifice, and that kind of way of living is spreading into the people around there. And there's suggestions in the Bible. If you go back to Genesis 15, there's suggestions that God has kind of given them time, like hundreds of years earlier. There's been warnings. They've been saying like, turn away from this. Don't carry out these practices. Don't carry out this child sacrifice. And God has been quite patient there. And so what the text, I would argue, is suggesting that God is not concerned about the ethnicity of these groups. He's not concerned about their culture more generally. He's concerned about their actions, and he is commanding this as a way of intervening there to deal with those actions. Because one of the features of a genocide, and I spend quite a lot of my time talking about it as a history teacher and dealing with those topics, one of the features often is that it's about eradicating an ethnic group or a grouping. And actually, the Israelites themselves weren't an ethnically pure grouping. Those stories in the Bible weren't about the Israelites trying to establish themselves like that. I mean, Moses, mentioned earlier, he married a Kishite, an Egyptian. There's the story of Rahab, who's one of the residents of Canaan, and she actually later marries an Israelite as well. And she is another one who survives this narrative as well. And she's an interesting character that we haven't got time to go into loads of detail, but she kind of emphasizes that in this like quite dark episode of human history, that actually God is both the judge, but he is also merciful at the same time. And for us as humans, that's quite a tricky thing to wrap our head around, that God can be these things at once. But that is the reality of the text.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the whole sort of subject on God gives life and takes it away, and how does that sit with us? And I guess suffering and the suffering that would have been brought on it. It feels to me there's another podcast just sitting there ready to go. So I think we'll definitely be trying to touch on that at some point as well, because there's far more that could be said there. So, all right. I mean, sort of developing on from that, Christianity likes to pose itself as a peaceful religion. You've sort of described how the Bible is trying to aim towards peace, and in fact, as you've already said, Jesus is often called the Prince of Peace. But if you were to be a critic of the Bible, and I guess even more broad than that, religion in itself, it could be said that often they are the root or part of the root causes of many wars outside of the Bible, but later on from that time. So Crusades, for example, would be a great example of that. I think that feels like a fair accusation, and I'm sure there are other examples of as well where the Bible has been used to encourage and lead to war rather than peace. So how does that stand on? What do those look like? Why are they happening?
Yeah, and it's an understandable criticism when you look at some of the narratives that we've just talked about, and the Bible is something that can be used and abused and misused. And with the kind of those narratives we were talking about, I've said like that the Bible, I think, is fairly clear that this is a very specific context and this is a one-time thing, and we shouldn't be generalizing beyond that. But yeah, throughout history, there have been a number of wars where the Bible has seemingly been used to justify. You mentioned the Crusades, most famously, so sort of 1095, Pope Urban II stands up at the Council of Clermont and preaches a crusade and calls on Western Christians to go and liberate the Holy Land from the Muslim conquerors. But then there's a series of other crusades as well where there's similar kind of motivations. They go off to Spain at one point to liberate Al-Andalus from the Muslim conquerors. If you prefer colder climes, there's also a Baltic crusade as well. There's an option.
Oh, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
What are they trying to get in the Baltic area?
Yeah, it's the Baltics. There's pagans up there as well.
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah,
Right.
I know, yeah.
But no Jerusalem.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Did they realise how cold it was?
Jerusalem in some ways was the ultimate goal. We haven't really got time to go into this, but the Fourth Crusade doesn't even get to Jerusalem. They're on such a robbing spree that they rob a Christian city en route from Dara, and then they get as far as Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, a Christian city, rob that, claim it, and go home. And I think that in some ways that's quite a helpful diversion because it speaks to the multifaceted nature of human motivation.
Right.
Like,
are you saying that they're not just doing this for?
I'm saying that there might be here some other motives going on. Actually, it's a topic I teach at A level, and we get students writing about that. And ultimately, yes, religion clearly is important to them, and they do use it. But there's power, there's politics, there's economic motivations, there's a chance to get rich. And there's other conflicts we could talk about throughout history where the Bible seemingly has played a role in the way that people use it as a proof text or as a way of justifying. So there's the Reconquista of Spain, there's the colonization of South America, the English Civil War, a bit closer to home. Both sides would be very clear that God's on their side.
Yeah, obviously.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And I think just because people believe the Bible justifies what they're doing and they believe that God has justified that doesn't necessarily make it true. And even the best case, if I was trying to argue against our premise that the Bible ultimately points us to an ethic of peace, I'd probably go for the wars of religion, as they're sometimes called, in the aftermath of the Reformation in the 16th and 17th centuries. And they could be, and some people try and frame them as entirely religious wars of Catholics versus Protestants. But again, it's not that simple. At one point, you've got Catholic France siding with Protestant states. There's politics involved here too. So I think we need to be careful that just because the Crusaders claim that the Bible motivates them and justifies them, it doesn't necessarily make it true. Because the Bible is a set of teachings. It's not a motive generator. We bring our own ambitions, our own goals, our own ideas. The late Pope Francis, used the analogy of the Bible being like a book like fire. Okay. And he also called it a hand grenade in a similar speech, but which is an interesting one. About it's like having a hand grenade in your closet.
Wow!
And the fire analogy, I think, is quite helpful for us because fire can burn, it can devour, it can destroy, but it can also be used to provide warmth. It can be used to provide life. So the Bible is a book like any other that can be used and abused, but actually, when we look at the broader ethic, as we've been discussing, and as Stuart will unpack more later, it's peace and reconciliation that's the ideal.
Yeah, okay. And I mean, the Crusades, not to sort of linger on them for too long, but they were seen as this sort of holy war, somehow justified by the Bible. So, and I think I can imagine the idea of having a holy war is mooted in a number of different wars, sort of both past and probably future as well, I'm sure. So how do you get to the point where you can sort of say from the Bible perspective that there is such thing as a holy war? Is there such thing as that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it doesn't fit with the broader ethic of the Bible, and there's a few different ways of understanding war and dealing with war and the rightness of war that you can glean from the Bible. I think to generalize, to simplify, I'd probably suggest that holy war is not a legitimate understanding of war based on the Bible, but there's three ways that Christians have traditionally placed frameworks of understanding war and what's legitimate or not with war. And they are just war, Christian pacifism, and then a bit more recent, this idea of Christian realism.
Right.
So just war.
Yeah, go on, take us through these.
Yeah, should I briefly
quickly?
take you through without becoming too much like an A-level RE lesson? I'll try my best.
I think we're well past that.
Yeah,
now.
I mean, sorry, you've invited a teacher on here.
If people have listened to so far,
you've got two teachers on this here tonight. You're in trouble, I'm afraid. So just war comes out of this like seeming tension that the ultimate ethic, as I've argued, is like the Bible of the Bible is peace and reconciliation. Yet force is used in the Bible passages on numerous occasions, okay, and is seemingly condoned in certain occasions. Yeah. And it comes particularly, they would use as their text as a bit in Romans. So it's written by Paul, who's one of the followers of Jesus, and he talks about how governments are entrusted with like a level of power, and he has language about not bearing the sword in vain. So there seems to be a legitimating of governments having authority and having power over people's lives. And so when Christianity moves from being kind of a more kind of persecuted minor faith to being more accepted in the 4th century, we get something that's sometimes called the Constantinian shift. We're not going to get into that now, but be another podcast. But this Christians go from being the persecuted to being in a place of actually we could be in government. And how does that work? Because if you're in government, there's the prospect that you might need to use violence, you might need to use force
to maintain the status quo.
Exactly. Yeah. So the principle essentially is that if there's going to be a war, if you're going to need to use violence, there's got to be a just cause. Okay, it's got to have a just and valid reason for it. So maybe liberating a particular group or stopping something horrible that's going on. There's got to be right intention behind it. It can't be you just want your neighbour's resources. And also the one that's often forgotten with waging wars is there's got to be a right outcome. There's got to be an agreed process of this is what we're aiming for. There's a plan. We're going to make this a better situation. And Augustine, who talks about this, one of these church fathers, even as he's saying this, he talks about lamenting the necessity of just war. This isn't something Christians should be entering into in a kind of thoughtless and a joyful way. Actually, there's a horror to that, even when you enter into it. And actually, that's
in modern day, I guess we sort of the weapons of mass destruction type scenario would be classified in that sort of category, would it?
Yeah, exactly. And that's quite a common framework that Christians have used for sort of hundreds, if not a couple of thousands of years to look at war. You could go a different way and you could take a more pacifistic approach, and I think we'll explore that in more detail later. But essentially, that becomes really prominent in the wake of the 16th century and the Reformation that I mentioned earlier, this divide between Protestants and Catholics. It's a response to some of the violence that's going on there, and groups like the Anabaptists and the historic peace churches, the Quakers, who we'll talk a bit more about later. They say, actually, look back to tradition, look back to the first couple of centuries, the status quo for Christians was peace. And they use this phrase of like violence being outside the perfection of Christ. And so Christians should not wield the sword. Some of them would even say that Christians shouldn't even be in government, some of them would say, because of the possibility that you might need to use violence. And that's another kind of framework that's been put on the Bible and a kind of takeaway that people have sometimes had. Mm-hmm. The last one, which is more recent, which I find really interesting, is something called Christian realism. So it's this idea from an American theologian called Reinhold Niebuhr. Now, Niebuhr was a pacifist, and he was a pacifist in the 1920s. And depending on how well you know your history, a pacifist in the 1920s is okay. But as you move into the 1930s, it becomes more problematic because you get the rise of fascism, you get Hitler, you get Mussolini, and then ultimately you get the failure of appeasement and the Second World War.
It's easily being a pacifist when there's no wars.
Exactly, exactly. And then, like we're having this discussion tonight, and it's quite a heavy topic, and I don't want to make it any more heavy, but this has been quite a theoretical topic for many people in the UK for the last 20, 30 years. I don't think it's going to be theoretical for much longer for us. I think we are going to have to think more about what our view is of violence and what we think about peace.
Right.
Just to make it
happy days, everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Just making it even more easy listening podcast. And so Niebuhr, his response to this was essentially not to fully abandon his pacifism, but introduce this idea of realism. We have to be realistic. We've got this almost kind of moral paradox. Jesus preached this gospel of love and non-violence, yet we live in this violent, this fallen world. And he basically spoke of and wrote about Christians needing to get their hands dirty. That actually we don't have this option of disengaging from the world, because actually we'd be shirking responsibility. We'd actually be unloving. And obviously the example from then is like things like the Holocaust in the Second World War, actually, and standing up to Nazi Germany and that totalitarianism. So those are the kind of three main ways I think Christians would deal with like war in terms of a framework for understanding it. I suggest that holy wars like crusades and things like that don't really fit within any of those frameworks. That they would be a no-go for me.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we're gonna dive a little bit more into those pacifism and realism types thoughts in the second part of our podcast. I think we'll take a short break now, Andy. That's been really, really helpful to go through all of that, and we're going to look at how this all sort of plays itself out into sort of our faith nowadays. And if you were a Christian today, what would you be doing, and what would you look at? A bit of Jesus in there as well. Why not? So yeah, we'll take a short break, and we'll be back in a bit. Welcome back, everybody. Now, during the break, as usual, we ran a little quiz, and this one is actually on famous sayings about peace. So we asked them, we gave a famous saying and then gave some options to who could potentially have said it, and see how the audience get on and how good they are at guessing these. So Jeff, over to you. What was the first quote, and how did we get on with the answers?
Great. So the first quote was, "It is easy to break down and destroy. The heroes are those who make peace and build."
Okay, yeah. And what were the options?
So nobody thought it was Buddha. Then we have 17% thought it was Mother Teresa. Then 33% thought it was Nelson Mandela. And coming in at first with 50% is Mahatma Gandhi.
Right. Now, I've been a bit cruel here because I haven't actually told Jeff the answer. Jeff, what is the answer? Do you know?
I have absolutely no idea.
It was Nelson Mandela. Yes. So well done, the 33% or whatever who got that one right. I'm assuming there was no Googling being done to get these answers. Brilliant. All right, let's do one more of these and let's see what's the next quote. What do we have?
All right. The other quote we had was, "Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding."
I can see in front of you the answers are changing as we speak, so people are still getting in their answers. Right, what were the options and how do we go?
So nobody went for Theresa May.
I threw that one in as a curveball.
Shocking. Only the dyslexics like me thought it said Mother Teresa. Then the next one is Mother Teresa at 11%. Then 22% thought it was Albert Einstein, and at the top, 67% is the Dalai Lama.
Yeah. Any thoughts, Jeff?
I mean, Dalai Lama was what I'd lean towards.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you are wrong. It was Albert Einstein.
Wow.
Yeah.
There we go.
Great thinker of peace. Cool. Well, that was a nice little exercise there to test the intellectual capacity of our audience. That was 22% who got that one. So we can maybe say at least a third of the audience is on fire tonight. The rest of them, maybe not quite so much. And we still have Andy with us.
Hello again.
Yes. And now we have been joined by Stuart Masters. Good evening, Stuart.
Good evening, Luke.
So actually, we first met many years ago in a professional capacity, but it's been a long time since we hung out, and so very kind of you to accept my invite to come on to our
Very
podcast.
pleased to be here.
Yeah, and in fact, you are the first guest we've had come along who's from a different type of church, which is exciting. And great that we're able to get different perspectives on these types of topics. In fact, you are a Quaker.
I am.
Yes, welcome, Quaker. And in fact, if anybody knows Birmingham history, Quakers have quite a strong connection to the city. So it's great that we can get a Quaker on as one of our first guests. Why is Quakers so connected to Birmingham, Stuart? What's that about?
I think it's primarily because Birmingham was a city that didn't place restrictions on non-conformist Christians setting up businesses. And so in the 18th and 19th century, Quakers were well, many Quaker families were big business people.
Yeah.
And so the significant ones in Birmingham, of course, are the Cadbury family,
Yes.
quite
Yeah,
important in terms of chocolate. We've also got, interestingly, the gun maker, the Galton family.
Right.
We'll come back to them because
Yeah.
it's an interesting paradox, isn't it? Quakers and guns don't go too
making
well
money
together.
out of war,
Yeah.
but not necessarily wanting to go to war.
Absolutely.
Right.
And there's other famous figures in Birmingham like Joseph Sturge, who was a radical politician in the 19th century and an abolitionist.
So a rich heritage within Birmingham. So
Indeed,
it's
yeah.
perfect
And there's
to-
quite a lot of meetings near this area, around this area.
Yes, there are. So perfect for a Birmingham-based podcast, I feel.
Yeah.
And the topic of war and peace is one that sits very close to the hearts of Quakers.
Indeed.
So I'm glad that we could get your perspective on things. So yeah, maybe first it'd be great just to have a little intro into you and your faith and work, and yeah, what's your sort of take on all this?
Okay, well, I'm a Brummie, as you can probably tell from my accent.
Yeah, well,
It's
because
terrible, isn't
actually,
it?
I don't think anybody else is a Brummie on this podcast.
Oh,
no.
there you go. I'll have to put it on a bit more heavy. You know.
Yeah,
All
I think you
right,
do. Yeah, I'm northern. Yeah, absolutely.
So I was born in Rubery of car worker stock, and in the Methodist Church. Worked for many years in the social housing sector, and then the Methodist Church didn't hold me, and through a lot of my adult life, I had no particular faith, but came to Quakers about 20 years ago, and that really was a fundamental change in my life. It changed my career and all sorts of things. And I ended up working as a tutor at Woodbrook Quaker Study Centre, which until recently was a college in Selly Oak. It's now a virtual organisation. And so for the last 20 years or so, I've been researching, teaching and writing about Quakers. And so it's very much been my life ever since.
Brilliant. It's great to have you along tonight then. So maybe the first question should be, what is a Quaker? For all those people listening going, I have really no idea, isn't it sort of oats or something?
Yeah, it's a strange man on an oats box.
Yeah. What is a Quaker? How does that differ from any other denomination of church?
I mean, Quakers have been around for nearly 400 years, so they are a product of, Andy talked about the English Civil War. I mean, they're very much on the parliamentary side, interestingly, to complicate the peace story again. A lot of them were fighting in the Civil War on the parliamentary side. So they're one of the radical groups that come out of that time. And I think what's a characteristic of Quaker faith is a desire to strip away everything that might get in the way of a direct inward relationship with God in spirit. And so they stripped away liturgies and outward images. And if you know anything about Quaker worship, it tends to be in silence, sitting together, listening for the divine voice, trying to hear what God is calling you to do, and then trying to be faithful in putting that into action in your life. And when you put it into action in your life, that's your testimony.
Okay.
And one of those testimonies happens to be a peace testimony.
Right. I think, in sort of modern society, the Quakers were referenced in a Fleabag episode. For those who are who may be into that, there is a very funny line that's said by the main character in that, which I won't now go into.
I think it must have been Quakers desperate for some publicity,
well,
to be honest with you.
Well, in that particular part of the show, they were in a Quaker service which was all quiet, and so people then said what was on their mind, which. The person who said it was very funny about what was on their mind, but I think usually it's more faith-based.
It was probably divinely inspired.
You never know. I'm not sure it was, but it was very funny either way.
It's definitely scripted. Just for a few quick definitions. So if we're talking about non-conformists, so at the time we're talking about churches that aren't a part of the organised state church. So in the UK, that would be not a part of the Anglican Church. And then if we're talking about liturgy, that's when we talk about mostly in the Catholic and Anglican Church. So the established churches, they often have set readings or set things that there would be read out by all churches in all places. So those set fixed readings are what we mean by liturgy, and that's what a nonconformist is.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really helpful. Yeah, so we're not having in the Quaker service. There's not a liturgy. There's not a set structure in the same way that you might get in a Catholic or C of E service.
No, the idea is that the gathered people listen to Christ, who's the high priest amongst them, and he is their teacher and leader.
Okay. And so Quakers, I think, are known for having stronger opinions on peace maybe than other denominations. So, but firstly, I guess it would be good to get your take on how you see the idea of peace developing in the Bible. Andy's sort of taking through more of the war side of things. Yeah. We're going to focus more on the peace now. And
I get the nice bits.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah. So how does that idea come through into in the Bible?
So as Andy did, I think it's important to start with the big picture story. So we start off with God creating all things, and all things are good and are in harmony. And humans are part of that, symbolically in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Then things go wrong. And I think what we can say is that humans become capable of asserting themselves over and against God and assuming that they know best and they're going to do what they want to do. And of course, that's a catastrophic disrupting of the goodness of the creation.
Right.
And one of the things that comes out of that, there's lots of negative things that come out of this sort of falling out of alignment with the divine order of things. One key thing is violence, conflict, murder, destruction, injustice. Mm-hmm. And we see this play out in Genesis. This is really the crucial first book of the Bible that tells us about the goodness of everything and how it all goes wrong.
Yep.
And so, for example, you get the founding murder. Murder comes into human society. Cain kills his brother Abel. We also then see human society getting even more depraved, even more violent, even more unjust. And so in the story of the flood, so God sends a flood and we see Noah and the ark and all of that. What God is saying is going on there is that humans have got so violent that there's a need to cleanse everything and start again. Mm-hmm. So the Bible is really starting well, but then recognizing that violence is a fundamental problem. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons there's so much violence in the Bible is because that's one of the key problems that needs to be resolved.
I think this is a good sort of taster for our next topic, which we're going to do on sin. So actually, a lot of what you described there is exactly that. Yeah. So
absolutely. Sin, being out of alignment with God's order. I think that's the way Quakers would see it, and it's leading into all sorts of negative consequences. Now, as Andy said, the Hebrew people are called by God out of the ways of the world. We might say the ways of empire, physical force, brutal exploitation of people and so on. And the Hebrew people are meant to be called out of that. They're actually liberated from slavery, a really serious version of that kind of injustice, and called to live differently. And one of the ways that happens is that God gives them a law to live by. And interestingly, in this case, the law seems to be trying to find ways to limit that evil. So we see the 10 Commandments, for example. One of the obvious ones is don't murder, but 4 of the others are important in terms of causing conflict. We talk about adultery, we talk about stealing, lying, and coveting things from others. Mm-hmm. These are all things that cause conflict. And so what God seems to be trying to do with God's people is give them some rules that allows them to limit the evil that surrounds them.
Yeah,
and this is a way of living differently in the world. Of course, the whole story of the Hebrew people is they often get it wrong. They sometimes get it right. And if we think about the texts about war, it's often to do with this big narrative in the Old Testament. When God's people are faithful to what God is telling them to do, they are successful. They are victorious. Mm-hmm. When they fail to be faithful to what God requires them to do, things go wrong, they suffer, they're exiled, they're defeated, and so on. And so we need to fit those texts into that kind of narrative we're talking about. So there's a desire to heal this rift between God and humanity. God's people are given some rules to live by, which seeks to wean them off the ways of the world so that they can live in a different way.
Mm-hmm. And I presume that then develops from the Old Testament there into sort of what Jesus does and how that fulfills that process, right? Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the story then moves on to, as Andy said, the concept of shalom. Shalom is God's way. Shalom, in a sense, is that natural harmonious order at the beginning of creation. How do we get that back to that? And so we talked about the prophet Isaiah, and so we've got this vision of a peaceable kingdom that the Messiah will bring, the messianic age, where you will go back to that kind of right relationship, right ordering and harmony. And I think, are we going to look at a text?
Well, yeah. So one of my questions is, okay, we this shalom has been brought up a number of times, and we know that the Bible wants us to go towards peace. But does the Bible actually offer any methods or any guidance to how to get there? Is there any teachings associated with being in that sort of peaceful state on how to achieve it?
I mean, what I would say is that certainly for Quakers, the discipline is to seek to be brought back under the ordering of God's Spirit. So one of the things that we still have in our book of discipline as Quakers is bring the whole of your life under the ordering of the Spirit of Christ. And so Quakers are... One of the convictions of Quakers, despite the complexities and the difficulties of this, it is possible to live like Jesus in the world. It is possible to allow the way of the Prince of Peace to be revealed in our lives, to the extent to which we're prepared to be faithful to God's order and to bring ourselves under that ordering. And that requires us to listen deeply, to listen for the divine voice, to see how that is consistent with what the Bible tells us, and then to find the courage to live in a way that's consistent with what we found to be true in our own experience.
So that you highlighted the Sermon on the Mount as being previously to me as being an interesting area to look at in how Jesus particularly sort of instructs us into that peace. So I think, Jeff, I got a few verses from. We're not going to do the whole Sermon on the Mount, which is an amazing set of verses, but probably too much for us to cover in one night. But we've got a few different bits of it to highlight. So, Jeff, what have we got here?
Yeah, great. So it comes from the book of Matthew in chapter 5. The first verse we're going to look at is verse 9, and it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Skipping down to verse 38, and it says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." So that's quoting from the Old Testament rules that you talked about. And Jesus says, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." And further on in verse 43, "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you."
And these are pretty hard verses to live by, I'd say, and we're very, I guess, controversial to Jesus' audience at the time.
Absolutely.
And yeah, even now they sound very difficult to do. So these are what is Jesus trying to get to here? What's he trying to teach us about?
I think this is about moving from constraint to a new life. So if a law gives you some guidelines that you try to follow, Jesus comes as the one who brings the possibility of a fundamentally new life. It's not necessarily just about following laws. It's about your whole motivation, your whole inner self being transformed. And so if the law said, in order to constrain violence and war, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, it limits the vengeance.
Yep.
What Jesus is saying is, I bring the possibility of living God's peace in a real way, because I bring the possibility of fundamental transformation of the human will, fundamental transformation of the human nature. If you follow me and you enter into my life, you will live the way I lived and what I've taught. And of course, that for Quakers is the bar, really. That's the intention, is to be followers of Jesus, not just by the letter, but by a fundamental inward transformation.
A high bar
Indeed.
to achieve, and I'm sure hence that. I
And
guess.
Quakers haven't done it, because we're human like everyone else, and we'll talk a bit about that later.
Yeah, well, but I guess that's where forgiveness comes in and various other things. But yeah, it's Jesus is setting us quite the high bar to try and achieve it. But so, are we saying that if we were to follow these these teachings and that would lead to more peace within ourselves or within society?
I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? How will God's kingdom come? How will the peaceable kingdom come? And of course, most of us think that it will require some decisive new action on the part of God. But the question is, what part did Jesus' followers play in that? And of course, Quakers, being what one of the peace churches would say, if you are a disciple of Jesus, then you are called to try and embody his way in the world as at least a visible hope for what is to come. And so however difficult it might be and however unrealistic it might seem, that is what Jesus is calling you to do. And you may well fail, but that doesn't mean to say that what Jesus was teaching is not what God really wants us to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So if you were to sort of act in a peaceful way, what does that mean to you, both as a state of mind and the idea of non-violence? You know, as a Quaker, how are you trying to live that out? And what does it mean?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it is about having integrity and recognizing that your outward life reflects the nature of your inward spiritual state. And so what Quakers would say is it's no good saying, I'm a pacifist, as a matter of principle. The test is, when push comes to shove, are you still capable of committing violence or not? And George Fox... there's a story of George Fox and William Penn. George Fox is one of the founders of Quakers. William Penn is the founder of Pennsylvania. I don't know if you know about that. Well, William Penn was an aristocrat who, as part of his aristocratic dress, wore a sword. Mm-hmm. And Penn came to Fox and said, I know that Quakers say you should be peaceable and you shouldn't wear a sword, but it's something that's very valuable to me. Should I give it up? And Fox said, you should wear it as long as you can. And what he meant by that was, you have to behave with integrity based on what your conscience is telling you to do. So peace is a process rather than a principle.
Right, so he's suggesting that at some point he may himself become uncomfortable with the idea of wearing...
Well, he did, and that ends the story. He turned up to meeting one day without his sword and says to George Fox, I wore it as long as I could. And so this is where the nuance comes in here. Quakers aren't being unrealistic in saying you've got to follow a particular rule. What they're saying is we believe it's possible to live that way, but only to the extent to which you are following your inward guidance, and you need to be true to that. And if you feel you can be violent, then you're still on the journey. The other thing that George Fox said was, I've had the very motivations that lead to conflict taken away from me. I live in that life and power that takes away the occasion of all wars. And so this is about, where are you on the spiritual journey? In a sense, the ultimate is a complete inability to be violent when you're living fully in the spirit. But it's not an all or nothing situation. It's a direction of travel.
So how, and this might be possibly an area to take too long, but how would you describe somebody having got to that point? You know, what happened for them to decide, actually, one day I'm not going to wear a sword or whatever? Have they been studying the scriptures? What has led to them to that point, do you think?
Well, first of all, through most of history, Quakers will have a really interesting balance between what they read in the scriptures and what they find within themselves in their own experience. And this is not about deciding something. This is about what happens to you. You can't do anything about it. You can't absolutely control it. All you can do is make yourself available. Be attentive to God's voice within you. Try your best to be clear about what God is calling you to do, and then seek to be faithful to that. So it's not really about choice. It's more about process. It's more about spiritual experience. This is something about Quaker spirituality. It's not an all or nothing. It's you start from somewhere, and you try to be faithful to what God is telling you to do, and you move across time to a place at which maybe ultimately you literally couldn't hurt anyone else.
Okay. All right. So this may have already been answered in what you just said then in my next question, but are all Quakers the same then in how they look at violence and non-violence and peace and that kind of thing? Or I assume there must be a spectrum if they're going on that journey. And do you see, I guess with the journey as well, do you see if somebody is sort of peaceful and not wishing to fight, they're somehow more spiritually holy than somebody who's prepared to fight? Is there sort of a value judgment being made here as well? I don't know, but
I mean, in some ways, yes, I think.
Right.
Because absolute non-violence is the result of being entirely under the ordering of the Spirit of Christ. Now, whether that's possible or not in this life is the big question. So you have to be true to what you feel your motivations are at this point in time. Are you still being motivated by the old, corrupted, fallen way of Adam, is often the way it's called, or are you being motivated by the Spirit of Christ? And that's not easy. And in many ways, although Quakers are called a historic peace church, in the big picture, they sit somewhere between Christian realism and absolute pacifism.
Okay.
Because if you say that peace is a process and not everybody gets there, or many of us don't get very far along that journey, we will do different things in our lives. So, for example, when the First World War happened, this was traumatic for Quakers. They'd been recognised in the past as conscientious objectors as long ago as the early 18th century. Mm-hmm. But when conscription happened in 1916, Quaker men of conscription age had a choice to make. And in practice, they went one of three ways. Some Quaker men took an absolute objection position and went to prison. Mm-hmm. Some Quaker men joined the forces and fought, and some adopted alternative service. And so the Quaker community as a whole said, we have a commitment to peace, but individual friends, depending on their conscience, took different decisions. And the Cadburys is a good example of this. George Cadbury's sons, Egbert Cadbury, became an awarded fighter pilot during First World War, whereas Lawrence Cadbury helped set up the Friends Ambulance Service, which was an alternative service, which of course sits between fighting and being an absolute pacifist. And so you can see that there's some nuance in all of that.
And in the Quaker world, if they didn't go to war, were they seen as somehow a better Quaker? Or were they given an extra badge on their lapel somehow? I don't know. Or was there a judgment being made about whether they did that or not?
I mean, it wasn't a matter of a disownment. You weren't kicked out because you chose to fight. So I think there's always been a distinction between what we as a whole community say is right. Mm-hmm. And what individuals feel they have to do in the circumstances that they find themselves. And so this historic peace church also has a kind of a pragmatic element to it, because it sees peace as a process of spiritual development.
I think in these sort of situations, you'd love to have like a black and white answer, but it feels as soon as you start scratching underneath the surface, it's all shades of grey.
Yeah, and I think that's because we're all caught between the world as it is and the world we are promised we will enjoy. And so we're back to that thing about the promise of a new creation, of Shalom, the peaceable kingdom. This is coming, but we're not there yet. The world is still full of violence. It's full of injustice. It's full of hatred and destruction. How do we place ourselves within the tension between those two things? And Quakers as a corporate community say, we're in the peaceable kingdom, but Quakers as individuals in making particular decisions find themselves in various places because they've got one foot in the world and one foot in a commitment to the peaceable kingdom.
Brilliant. Okay. I think we're gonna draw a line under that particular bit of the podcast now. So thank you so much, Stuart, for sharing your journey of faith and what you think, how Quakers take on this. So at this point in time, we're gonna pause, and in fact, the people in the room are gonna have the opportunity to talk with the panel further and do a bit of a Q&A. But we're gonna stop the podcast here. But if you do want to sort of join us in the future, then and get to sort of join in with the Q&A, then come along to one of our future sessions. We have got 2 coming up this spring season. One is on what is sin, which we've just trailed a little bit about, I think, in our discussions, and then the next one will be after that will be on the Easter story. So all great topics to be covering off. As I mentioned earlier, if you are listening to us now, please do follow and rate us on whatever podcast platform you're on. And I'd like to thank all of our guests and our audience for being here tonight, and we will see you all again soon. I'll do one of the questions. This is to either panelist. The question is, war. What is it good for? So I don't know if there's.
Doesn't the song answer the question?
Yeah, actually, we refer the
Absolutely
audience to the song lyrics, and they can get that from there. Yeah.